Hello everybody and welcome to today's episode of the Activist Lawyer podcast. I'm delighted to have a person in the studio today. We're not doing a Zoom call. I am joined by solicitor Enda McGarrity. Enda, thank you for coming today.
No problem, Sarah. It's great to be here.
Enda is a solicitor with PA Duffy and Company. He joined as a paralegal in 2018, having graduated from Queens University Belfast with honours. After completing his apprenticeship with PA Duffy and Company, Enda qualified as a solicitor and is now leading the Human Rights and Public Law Department within the firm. Enda's caseload consists of public inquiries, inquests, judicial review and complex litigation against state agencies, including wrongful death claims and environmental actions. He's currently instructed by Northern Ireland Bereaved Families for Justice in the ongoing UK COVID-19 inquiry, which is considered to be the largest public inquiry in UK history. In addition, Enda is instructed by bereaved families in the Republic of Ireland to seek a public inquiry to investigate the state's handling of COVID-19, as well as acting in multiple ongoing wrongful death actions in respect of deaths related to major outbreaks of COVID-19 in nursing homes. Okay, well, again, thanks for joining us. And we'll get into some of that work, fascinating stuff. But firstly, take us back a little bit in time and tell us why you decided to get into law and how that came about.
Yeah, so it's a good question. It's the truth is it was never something that I had a set notion on, or there wasn't a light bulb moment at a young age where I said that I needed to do law. It was more of an evolution of events. So I suppose I was never awfully interested in STEM subjects in school. I was never going to be a doctor or a pharmacist or an engineer or anything like that. So I kind of chose law by default. But what was more important in that period, in my sort of late teens, early 20s, when you're starting to develop your own worldview, I was doing an awful lot of reading, in particular reading about history, all sorts, but it generally had a slant which was about some sort of historic injustice, you know, whether it was Irish history or African history or whatever it was. And I think looking back, that kind of ingrained in me the interest in human rights, not necessarily in human rights law, but just in human rights issues and the idea of the powerful against the weak and violence and discrimination and those types of issues. So as well as that, in that sort of developmental period, I had travelled to Africa a few times. Couple of times to Zambia for charity work, which I'm still involved in, and then once to Cape Town for a human rights internship with an NGO. And there, that was a short but very impactful experience. I worked for an NGO called PASAP, and they essentially worked with asylum seekers who were fleeing persecution in other African countries, places like the Congo and Uganda. And you typically heard really, really tragic stories of people fleeing wars and things like that. So that kind of woke me up a little bit to the world. And when I came back from Africa on that occasion, I dove head first into my work. My brother Connell, who's my boss actually now, at the time when I was entering my undergraduate degree, he was probably just qualifying as a solicitor.
Okay.
So I'm sure that was in my mind, but his influence really came a bit later as I was leaving university and entering work. And pretty much straight away I started working with him. He had developed quite a niche for judicial review cases. So very early on as a paralegal in PA Duffy, I was brought into these judicial review cases, and that really just complemented what I'd been learning and had been interested in the years before that.
Absolutely. Well, you find yourself in a great place, especially in terms of experience. And one area that you mentioned there was, and that your firm have been working on, is inquiries, and in particular the UK COVID-19 inquiry, which I know you're heavily involved in. Some of our past guests on the Activist Lawyer podcast have been involved in this as well in various parts of the UK. But just in terms of maybe for some of our listeners, that type of work, what does it involve in general, in inquiry work, and how have you found it?
Inquiry work is it's an awfully big undertaking. Obviously with the COVID inquiry, It's an investigation into the UK government and devolved nations handling of COVID. But inquiries, they take different forms. You've obviously got in Northern Ireland things like the Bloody Sunday inquiry, which was long running. But typically they're set up to respond to some large scale event, disaster, typically something that involves mass casualties. And in this case, probably the biggest, or definitely the biggest amount of casualties since World War II in the COVID pandemic across the UK. So it's a really significant piece of work. We began really about 3.5 years ago. The inquiry only started hearings about a year ago.
Okay.
But the work to set it up and the mostly the bereaved work in terms of campaigning and bringing the inquiry about started a long time ago. And
does that include gathering all of the evidence, presumably, as well, from the families that you represent?
Yes, well, I suppose the first thing is getting the investigation, and that's not straightforward. The bereaved families across the UK started campaigning, I think, as early as April 2020, asking Boris Johnson to initiate an inquiry. There was reluctance at first. There was back and forth for quite a while, but ultimately he was backed into a corner and agreed to it.
Yeah.
So, and actually, funny enough, when he did give evidence in the inquiry before Christmas, very controversial and obviously emotive for many of the families that we represent. But one of the things he said at the end of his evidence, he made a comment about how the inquiry should look at the origins of the disease, which wasn't in the terms of reference. And the chair reminded him that he sets the terms of reference, and if he wanted to investigate that, he should have put it in the terms of reference.
Exactly.
So it's an insight into the lack of understanding from him about what an inquiry is and what it does.
My goodness. And Enda, your firm and you are really kind of trying to reach your clients and keep them as informed as possible with the process and with proceedings. And you're doing it through a podcast.
Yeah, you've pioneered that particular forum, but yeah, look, it's a large client group. There's close to 200 bereaved families from Northern Ireland alone, and we're just Module 2C hearings are just around the corner here, and that's the inquiries look at Northern Ireland political decision making. It starts in Belfast on the 30th of April. So yeah, look, it's another way to keep people informed.
Yeah.
Part of our role is really trying to get the voices of the bereaved out there. We really think that it's instrumental in the inquiry's work to hear from the bereaved and how their experiences, how the decision making had an impact on them and their families.
Absolutely. And how long? So you're at Module 2C now, and I think there's 5 or 6 modules.
At least. There's
okay.
7 announced.
Oh, really?
Already.
Right, okay.
So I think we're timetabled up until 2026 anyway.
2026?
Yeah, so we're, look, it's
my goodness. And that's just for the Northern Ireland?
Well, no, this is for the UK wide.
Right, okay.
So I think this will be the only time it'll come to Belfast. But every other hearing is in London. And it still looks at the devolved nations. So just before Christmas, we had Module 2, which was UK government decision making. And I was over in London for about 9 weeks at those hearings.
Right.
And that was essentially a look at how the UK took decisions during the pandemic. But given that affected people in Northern Ireland and that the Northern Ireland politicians were plugged in or should have been plugged into those conversations, it is important that we be there as well.
What's happening in terms of the Republic of Ireland, and is there any chance of a public inquiry happening there?
Yeah, so there's been a commitment to some form of investigation, or I think they're calling it an examination. We've been waiting for a long time for the government to publish terms of reference on how they see that investigation being carried out. The families have been very clear, since 2020 about what is required. It needs to be an open and transparent investigation, and it needs to have powers that give it teeth. It needs to be able to compel witnesses. It needs to be able to compel evidence, and the families need to have a core role in it. And the government have been very keen to distance themselves from a UK COVID inquiry approach,
right?
Which is fine. We're not saying they have to replicate that approach, because it's a massive inquiry, and the issues in the Republic of Ireland are more narrowly focused on care homes. So we're not saying they have to replicate that, but there's been this narrative put out about how an inquiry would turn into a witch hunt or a blame game. And that really misunderstands what inquiries are about. And it's no solace to the bereaved families who continue to grieve. And they've been blocked at every avenue from having those issues investigated. Gosh. You know, the access to justice for people in that position, it really isn't there.
Right.
You've got people who have lost loved ones in massive outbreaks of COVID in nursing homes, you know, up to 25 in some nursing homes dying within about a month, which is really shocking. And they can't even get the medical records from the home. Wow. They can't get their care records because of a loophole in the Freedom of Information legislation. So they're being forced to take litigation to seek this inquiry, and there's been obstacles put in their way.
They're still at that stage.
They're still at that
That's
stage.
Shocking.
The inquiry, it's moved on a little bit in that the initial position was that they wouldn't have any sort of investigation. Now they've said they'll have an investigation of sorts. It doesn't sound like they plan to give it the powers that it needs. But look, we'll see how it goes. But that's very much something that the families need in the Republic of Ireland to gain some closure. But more importantly, to make sure that they're properly equipped should this happen again. Because in Ireland, 80% of nursing homes are privatised. And that means that they don't really have that state oversight that is required. So it's a huge issue, and one that can't be allowed to be swept under the carpet.
No, I wasn't aware of that. Wow, that's shocking. Well, we look forward to seeing how that develops. And just another aspect of your work that we mentioned is the environmental matters that you've been working in. So anyone living in Northern Ireland will know Lough Neagh. And most people will know about the recent coverage around the serious pollution. I heard about it, a local radio programme had covered it extensively. I couldn't believe some of the stories that I heard emanating from that ecological disaster, which of course has costed livelihoods, so many animal deaths as well, and of course illnesses and sickness spreading across the affected area. So you've been involved, and what really, in your opinion, or what have you seen that has given rise to what's happened? Is it as bad as we've heard in terms of your clients being affected?
Yeah, it's a really, really significant issue for everyone in Northern Ireland, not just those we represent. It's the largest freshwater lake in Europe. It's the source of 40% of Northern Ireland's drinking water. On top of that, as you've mentioned, it's a big economic factor for all the fishermen that rely on it, for people who enjoy the amenity of the lough, which covers a huge area. So the ecological collapse, you know, it's a really fundamental issue that needs urgent intervention. We came to see it, the general public came to see it last summer when the blue-green algae appeared, and people will remember the aerial images of huge swathes of green emerald across the lough. And that was really the physical manifestation of years and years of degradation and neglect. And it's a combination of factors. It's a scientist would really be better placed to explain it, but pollution plays a role in it. The invasive mussels, which have come into the lough in recent years, play a role.
Oh gosh.
Heat plays a role, so climate change plays a role in it. And sand dredging, so that the lough is privately owned by the Earl of Shaftesbury, who's an English aristocrat. And there's obviously been a campaign to bring the lough into public ownership. So it's this combination of factors that has caused this issue, and it's now really difficult for people to ignore because it's right before our eyes.
Absolutely, gosh. And what type of legal action, I guess, can you pursue? I know it's early days, but what are people hoping for, and what can you provide? Yeah,
so the issues they're complex and numerous. There's different angles you can come at it from, depending on your objective, but the people we represent are really keen on, you know, having a plan in place to affect change. They realise that it won't happen overnight, but you know, that really lends itself to the idea that we need to act now. So it's really forcing the decision makers and the responsible departments to take action. To date, DERA, or the responsible department, There's perhaps a conflict within that department in itself, because that looks after agriculture and the environment, and the tension between each of those, and that there's an argument that some of the pollution is coming from agriculture, not all of it, but some of it. So there's an internal sort of tension there. But essentially, it's really an intervention. It's some kind of plan needs to be put in place that's backed by data and backed by science, and will have meaningful results. And to date, we just haven't seen that.
And is that area, so kind of environmental law, I suppose, and some climate justice work, it's quite new, and not new in the sense that these issues have been ongoing for years and there's many precedents, I'm sure, that people can rely on. But it seems to be an emerging area of practice within law. And most notably, we engage a lot with students and third level students or graduates, and that's an area that they want to get into. Do you think it's an emerging area of law, and is it something that you enjoy working on, and you'd like to kind of do more of that type of work?
I think it is. I find it absolutely fascinating and important. It's a really fast moving area. So, as recently as I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was a big ruling in the European Court of Human Rights for a group of Swiss women.
That's right.
2,000 women. An incredible case came together. They're all over 64. So their argument was that they had a particular interest in the Swiss government complying with their climate obligations, because it affected them significantly. So they came together and they got a landmark ruling, which recognised that the Swiss government's failure to implement effective climate policies interfered with their Article 8 rights to a private life. So that'll set a precedent.
Absolutely huge. Yeah, we were following that. Brilliant. Well, yes, I mean, it's something that is gaining more interest as things move on. Just going back a little bit, I suppose, to your casework and the type of work that you deal with. I mean, even there, I listened to your podcast earlier and I find it tough. I mean, you have clients there and families who've instructed you, and they're talking about COVID, and it took me back in time. You kind of block a lot of it out, but you realise how people really suffered and how their family members were treated and how that impacted the wider family. And it's really, really brought a tear to my eye. I find it heavy and quite difficult to listen to, but nonetheless extremely important to get their stories out and their messages out. How do you achieve any kind of balance between the work that you do, which is heavy going, and your life outside of work? How do you strike that balance, if you do?
With great difficulty a lot of the time.
Yeah.
But yeah, look, as you said, a lot of my work involves representing bereaved families, and it's a great honour to be able to do that. And you mentioned looking back at COVID, as a solicitor in any area, people will come to you with problems, and they want solutions. So the tendency sometimes can be to take those problems home with you, and to really put a lot of pressure on yourself. And I won't say that I don't do that. Yeah. I definitely do, like anyone, but I have some things that help me manage stress and manage workload. And the big thing really is football. I've played Gaelic football all my life. I don't do it as a stress management tool. I do it almost as a second job sometimes.
Really?
So
you're that committed.
Yeah, that brings its own stresses. But actually, when I'm down at our football field, whether it be 8-10 hours a week, I'm not thinking about anything else other than football.
You're so focused on it,
and it's been a really welcome thing to have. And everyone has always said, when I started law, you need to choose one. That's all I ever heard, because football's taken so seriously.
It is,
I know it's amateur. I think the new president of the GAA described it recently as amateur by name but professional by nature.
Absolutely.
And that is true. So people often said you can't do both, and I was always committed to try and buck that trend.
Good.
I can't say that I always do both as well as I could, but I manage them well enough together, I think.
Because you did play for Tyrone. Just talk back to the football.
at youth level,
very good.
These days I'm representing my club, and I'm from a small village, small community called Galway, just outside Dungannon. So
very good.
It's not only the actual playing of the football and the physical exercise, which is great for stress. It's that sense of community that the GAA can bring, and it's something that I don't think I'm giving up anytime soon.
Good.
Hopefully.
No. And it's that sense of community. I know down here, we've Down in Armagh playing, I think this weekend. I know very little about football, but I do have one child away to school in a Down shirt and one away in an Armagh jersey. So we'll see how that pans out. But it is important to have that release as well. And you do hear that, I suppose, a lot from our guests who've been on, who work in really challenging and intense situations, to have that kind of release. And often it's through sport or music. One of the questions we get asked a lot is from graduates or law students as well, who are saying we still find it very difficult to find a way into the world of human rights law. And how might we go about that? So I'm wondering, just in terms of your advice, what would you have for anybody who's listening who would like to follow in your footsteps and are maybe finding it a little bit difficult to get into the world of human rights and get some practice?
Yeah, look, there's countless other people who'd be better placed to provide advice to aspiring lawyers, but I can only speak for what has worked for me, and that's that I've always been led by my passion or interest. Wherever that may go, that's where I go. I couldn't see myself really doing any other area of law, to be honest. So stick with it, I suppose, is the answer. Yeah. It's rare that you're going to get into your first job and be handed your ideal case and be doing exactly what you want to do. But if you keep building your knowledge base and your skills, then ultimately you'll make yourself quite hard to ignore. Yeah. There's opportunities as well out there. I've mentioned that I done a human rights internship. I think at one point I applied for a job in the UN as well, but because I didn't speak two languages.
Yeah. We've all done that at one point.
Yeah, it was a bit of a post-university head stagger. But anyway, look, it was just, it's not something that I've always done. I've done other cases as well. Yeah. I've done plenty of litigation, medical negligence as well. So, but it's always been there. It's always been an interest, and it's something that I've done in my extra time. I've done work on a pro bono basis. I've done whatever I could do to try and work in that area, and thankfully now it's paid dividends.
Brilliant. And just with, your work is, I was just mentioned, it's quite intense, but it's something you obviously enjoy very much. But in terms of making real change, which ultimately is what lawyers want to do, especially for their clients on a kind of a personal and private level, but very often, in terms of a pursuit of justice in any one area that you're working in, how important is it to I suppose, how does it play an important role in your work or in kind of the legal human rights law work in general?
I think it's vital. Some lawyers are uncomfortable with the term activism. They maybe deem the law and activism as incompatible, and in some areas, rightly so. Yeah. But it's difficult to separate the two in the type of work that I do. Take environmental law, for example. We've mentioned the Swiss women's case. That's 2,000 people coming together, a groundswell of support and a recognition that true change will come about through using the law as a tool. And such groundbreaking success doesn't come about without a combination of activism and legal skills. So it doesn't mean that lawyers have to be indistinguishable from their clients. Yeah. But a happy partnership can work quite well. And if you look at any sort of, injustice down the years, there's always been lawyers paving the way. If you look at apartheid in South Africa, for example, is something that I have a huge interest in. I just finished a book called The Mandela Brief. It's about a lawyer called Sidney Kentridge, and he had really paved the way through the dark days in South Africa with really pivotal legal cases through representing Nelson Mandela, Steve Biko and others. So it plays a part. It's a real tool for change, and it's something that I don't think lawyers should shy away from.
Enda, it's been absolutely fantastic to have you here in our studio today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Sarah. It's been a pleasure.
This podcast was recorded in Granite Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Granite Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service. for our team using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.granitepodcaststudio.com.